Picture two mighty cities standing face to face across a river, their silhouettes etched against the twilight sky, one crowned with royal palaces, the other bustling with merchants and craftsmen. These are not just neighbors, but twins bound by blood yet torn apart by crowns. This is the story of medieval Europe's most fascinating paradox: twin cities and cross-border kingdoms, where loyalty was divided, cultures clashed, and destinies were written in the ink of rivalry. Think of Buda and Pest, two halves of a once unified people, split by a river and ruled by different hands. Or imagine the Rhine's rival banks, where German princes and French lords vied for control, turning a single community into a chessboard of power. What happens when a nation's heart beats in two separate bodies? When brothers become subjects of rival kings, the answers lie in the rise and fall of these extraordinary realms, where politics, ambition, and identity collided in ways that still echo today. This isn't just ancient history. The legacy of these divided cities lives on in the way borders shape our world, how cultural identities fracture and reform, and why some places never quite heal from the scars of old divisions. The story of cross-border kingdoms is a tapestry of human drama, of alliances forged and broken, of merchants who thrived by playing both sides, and of ordinary people caught between the whims of distant rulers. It's a tale of resilience, too, how communities adapted, resisted, and sometimes even flourished under the weight of dual loyalties. And perhaps most strikingly, it's a mirror to our own time, where geopolitical lines still cut through shared histories, leaving behind questions about who we are and where we belong. So let's journey back to an age when rivers were more than water. They were frontiers of power. We'll explore how these twin cities rose to glory, how they became pawns in the games of kings, and why their eventual decline holds lessons for today. Along the way, you'll meet scheming nobles, defiant burghers, and unsung heroes who navigated a world of shifting allegiances. You'll see how trade routes became lifelines, how faith and language divided or united, and how the very idea of a kingdom could stretch or snap across a border. By the end, you'll never look at a map the same way again, because the past isn't just behind us, it's beneath our feet, whispering secrets about the fragile, fierce nature of human belonging. At the heart of medieval Europe's most intriguing urban landscapes lay the phenomenon of twin cities, two settlements so close they could shout across a river, yet worlds apart in identity and allegiance. These weren't just neighbors, they were mirror images, reflecting each other's strengths and vulnerabilities while clinging fiercely to their own laws, rulers, and ways of life. Take London and Westminster, for example. Separated by the Thames, they functioned like two halves of a single organism. London thrived as a mercantile powerhouse, while Westminster served as the Crown's ceremonial heart. Their cooperation was pragmatic, a shared need for security and prosperity. But not all twins were so harmonious. Just look at Cologne and Deutz glaring at each other from opposite banks of the Rhine. One owed fealty to the Holy Roman Emperor, the other to local bishops, and their rivalry turned the river into a battleground of tariffs, spies, and occasional bloodshed. Geography dictated these relationships like an unseen hand. Rivers weren't just waterways, they were natural borders, carving cities into rival spheres. Mountains and valleys could either isolate communities or force them into uneasy alliances. Trade routes, those lifelines of medieval commerce, often determined whether twins became partners or competitors. A city like Ghent, split by the Scheldt, might unite to protect its lucrative wool trade, while others, like Buda and Pest, found themselves pulled apart by the ambitions of distant kings. Defense played a role too. Twin cities might share walls in times of war, only to resurrect those barriers as checkpoints once the danger passed. Yet beneath the politics, there was always a human story. Merchants who married across borders, artisans who smuggled techniques and secrets between workshops, families who whispered in two languages, all navigating a world where identity was as fluid as the rivers between them. This delicate dance of unity and division didn't just shape cities. It laid the groundwork for the rise of cross-border kingdoms, where rulers learned to exploit these fractures. After all, if you could control both halves of a twin city, you didn't just own a territory, you held the keys to its wealth, its people, and its soul. And that was power worth fighting for. Divided loyalties weren't just a political headache, they were a way of life for people in these twin cities. Imagine waking up in 14th century Ghent, where the bells of St. Bavo's Cathedral rang for Mass, but the tax collector at your door answered to the Duke of Burgundy. Your bread came from Flemish wheat, but the law that protected your market stall was signed by a king in Paris or an emperor in Aachen. This was the daily reality for thousands, a tightrope walk between local pride and distant crowns, where survival often meant mastering the art of dual allegiance. The Holy Roman Empire perfected this delicate dance of fractured authority. Take Cologne and Aachen, two jewels in the empire's patchwork crown. Both cities swore oaths to the emperor, but their real power lay with merchant guilds and archbishops who jostled for control. When imperial taxes grew too heavy, Cologne's burghers might quietly side with local clergy to resist, while Aachen's craftsmen played emperor and bishop against each other for lower tariffs. It was governance by negotiation, where loyalty flickered like candlelight, bending to whoever offered the best deal that week. Language and law turned these tensions into chasms. In Bruges, the Count of Flanders' court spoke French, but the fishmongers bargaining on the canals used Flemish. A dispute over stolen goods could hinge on which tongue the judge understood or pretended not to. Meanwhile, in Strasbourg, German-speaking magistrates enforced laws from Roman codes, while Alsatian peasants followed customs older than Charlemagne. These weren't just translation errors, they were cracks in the foundation of kingdoms, where a misheard word could spark riots or invalidate treaties. Religion deepened the divides. After the Great Schism split Christendom, twin cities like Regensburg and Passau might pledge to rival popes, turning river crossings into theological battlegrounds. A baker in one city could be excommunicated for selling bread to the wrong side, while monks smuggled relics across borders under cover of darkness. Yet amid the chaos, pragmatism often won. When Burgundy's dames needed Flemish wool or Rhenish wine, even bitter rivals found ways to lower drawbridges for a price. The true test came when empires faltered. Burgundy's glittering court managed Bruges and Ghent with a mix of pageantry and threat, showering them with festivals while stationing troops at the gates. But when Duke Charles the Bold fell at Nancy in 1477, both cities erupted, tearing down Burgundian banners to reclaim ancient privileges. Their rebellion wasn't just against taxes, it was a raw assertion that their first loyalty lay with the cobblestones under their feet, not some far-off throne. This push and pull defined Europe's most resilient cross-border kingdoms. Some, like Poland-Lithuania, thrived by granting cities near autonomy, letting Danzig and Vilnius flourish as semi-independent republics. Others, like fragmented Aragon, crumbled under the weight of Barcelona and Valencia's competing charters. The difference: visionary rulers understood that twin cities weren't problems to solve, but forces to harness. They built roads between rivals, blended legal systems, and turned divided loyalties into a strength. a network of checks and balances that kept any one power from growing too strong. Yet for every success story, there were a dozen failures kingdoms that collapsed when their twin cities pulled in opposite directions. Which brings us to the most fascinating question of all. When these delicate systems worked, what secrets did their rulers know? And when they failed, was it greed, pride, or simply the unstoppable tide of history? The answers lie in the rise and fall of three legendary realms, each a masterclass in the art of ruling divided hearts. The Habsburgs didn't just build an empire, they wove one together with vows and velvet diplomacy. When Maximilian I married Mary of Burgundy in 1477, he didn't just gain a bride, he stitched together the fractured cities of Flanders and Brabant under a single crown. Bruges and Antwerp, once rivals guarding their trade secrets like dragon's gold, suddenly found their harbors open to each other's ships, their guilds sharing privileges, their militias drilling under the same banner. This was the magic and the menace of strategic marriages. They could turn bitter divides into bustling crossroads overnight, but not all unions were so seamless. Take Aragon and Catalonia, where Ferdinand and Isabella's marriage in 1469 didn't just unite two kingdoms, it fused Barcelona's merchant fleets with Valencia's silk roads, creating a Mediterranean powerhouse. Their secret, respect for local pride. Barcelona kept its treasured usages laws, while Zaragoza's nobles retained their ancient rights. Contrast that with Naples and Sicily, slapped together like mismatched puzzle pieces by Charles V in 1516. Palermo's parliament and Naples' viceroys clashed endlessly, their shared crown feeling less like a bridge and more like a chokehold. Charisma made all the difference. When Philip the Good of Burgundy rode into Ghent in 1432, he didn't just demand obedience, he threw a banquet. For weeks, the city's butchers and bankers rubbed shoulders with his knights, toasting with Flemish beer and Burgundian wine. By the time the revelry ended, Ghent's walls hadn't been breached by siege engines but by spectacle. Yet even the most golden-tongued rulers couldn't erase deeper tensions. Those shared trade routes, they became lifelines until a war diverted them. Those merged militias, a boon until one city's soldiers were sent to die for the other's border skirmish. The cruel irony of these alliances was their fragility. Burgundy's glittering network, linked by marriages from Brussels to Dijon, collapsed in 2 generations when Mary's son Philip the Fair died young, leaving baby Charles V to inherit a patchwork of resentments. The very thing that made these unions brilliant, their flexibility, also made them volatile. Like a rope stretched between 2 towers, they held firm until the wind changed. And when it did, the fall was spectacular, because nothing bred rebellion like a once distant ruler suddenly demanding taxes for wars you never agreed to fight, in lands you barely recognized as your own. Yet for all their flaws, these marital mosaics reshaped Europe's map in ways we still see today. The Habsburgs' wedding bells didn't just ring for princes, they echoed in the cobblestones of market squares, in the ledgers of spice merchants, even in the accents of children who grew up speaking both German and Flemish. That's the paradox of cross-border kingdoms. Their greatest strength was also their fatal flaw. They could make 2 cities one, but only until the day someone asked which one truly mattered. And when that question came, the swords came out. Even the strongest alliances crumble when the threads of trust snap. And for Europe's cross-border kingdoms, that moment often came with the sting of betrayal. Take the Flemish uprisings of the early 1400s, when Ghent's weavers and Bruges merchants turned their looms into barricades. These weren't random riots, but calculated rebellions against Burgundian dukes who'd grown deaf to their city's needs. When Philip the Good hiked wool tariffs to fund wars in far-off Picardy, he forgot a vital truth. twin cities may share a crown, but their patience wears thin when their coin purses grow lighter. The revolt that followed wasn't just about taxes, it was a raw scream of cultural identity, as Flemish militias burned French-language tax scrolls in the squares where they'd once sworn oaths to Burgundy. External invaders smelled blood in these fractures. During the 100 Years' War, English armies didn't just attack French castles, they wooed Flemish cities with promises of cheaper English wool. The strategy was brutally simple: exploit the rift between local interests and distant rulers. Ypres, desperate to revive its dying textile trade, briefly defected to England in 1340, only to be reconquered by a French king who then punished the city by moving its lucrative fairs to rival Tournai. This was the fatal flaw of divided kingdoms. Their borders didn't just mark territory, they marked fault lines where ambition could pry cities apart. Nowhere was this clearer than in the slow-motion collapse of the Kalmar Union. For nearly a century, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway had shared a crown through careful diplomacy. But when Danish kings began favoring Copenhagen's merchants over Stockholm's iron exporters, Sweden's nobility saw the writing on the wall. The Stockholm bloodbath of 1520 wasn't just a massacre, it was the explosion of decades of economic neglect, proving that even the most strategic marriages couldn't survive when one partner felt like a second-class citizen. Could these collapses have been avoided? Perhaps if rulers had listened as closely to their city's grievances as they did to their own ambitions. A few visionary leaders nearly succeeded. Hungary's Matthias Corvinus kept Transylvanian Saxons loyal by granting them autonomy over mining rights, while Poland's Casimir the Great lured German settlers east with promises of self-rule. Their lesson was simple: twin cities would tolerate distant crowns, but only if those crowns respected the delicate balance of local pride and shared prosperity. Yet for every Matthias, there were a dozen short-sighted rulers who mistook obedience for loyalty until the day their subjects proved them wrong. And when those revolts came, they weren't led by faceless mobs, but by unforgettable characters who knew exactly how to weaponize divided loyalties. Figures like the iron-willed Countess Jacoba of Holland, who turned her people's resentment into a rebellion that outlasted 3 husbands and 4 sieges. History remembers rulers not just for the lands they conquered, but for the delicate seams they stitched or tore apart between rival cities. Take Charlemagne, that colossus of the early Middle Ages, who didn't just build an empire with his sword but with his law books. When he imposed the Lex Saxonum across his realm, he wasn't erasing local customs, he was weaving them into a shared fabric. Saxon merchants in Paderborn and Frankish traders in Aachen suddenly found themselves under the same weights and measures laws, their disputes settled by hybrid courts blending tribal traditions with imperial decrees. It was genius in its simplicity. Let cities keep their identity, but give them a stake in something larger. Then there were rulers who fumbled the balance. Richard II of England, facing revolt in 1481, made the fatal mistake of treating London and York as interchangeable cogs in his royal machine. When he slapped punitive taxes on both to fund his Irish wars, he ignored York's fragile economy, already reeling from Hanseatic trade bans, while London's goldsmiths absorbed the blow. The explosion was inevitable. York's craftsmen, led by the fiery tanner John Gras, didn't just protest, they armed themselves with the very tools of their trades, turning tanning knives and wool shears against the king's men. Richard's failure wasn't greed, it was tone deafness. He'd forgotten that ruling twin cities meant listening to their different heartbeats. But the unsung heroes of these divided realms were the administrators who worked the back channels. Men like Conrad von Hochstaden, the 13th century Archbishop of Cologne, who didn't just mediate between his city and rival dukes, he turned their rivalry into an economic engine. By granting Deutz a monopoly on Rhine tolls while letting Cologne's merchants bypass them with special permits, he created a system where both sides profited from controlled tension. Or Agnes of Navarre, the shrewd regent who governed Bayonne and Pamplona by playing their dialects against each other, issuing decrees in Basque to the mountain towns, then switching to Occitan for the coastal traders, ensuring no faction felt sidelined. Yet even the most brilliant strategies buckled under economic tides. When the Baltic herring trade shifted east in the 1500s, Lübeck's merchants watched their wealth bleed to Danzig and with it, their loyalty to the Hanseatic League. No amount of royal charters could compensate for empty warehouses. Similarly, when the Danube's trade routes withered during Ottoman wars, the once interdependent twins of Buda and Pest became backwaters, their shared prosperity crumbling like their neglected bridges. The lesson etched in these stories is timeless. Rulers who saw twin cities as partners thrived. Those who treated them as piggy banks or pawns paid in rebellion. Because in the end, the mortar holding these kingdoms together wasn't just law or force, it was the fragile, irreplaceable faith of the people who called both banks of the river home. And when that faith broke, so too did empires. Commerce turned the rivers between twin cities into battlegrounds long before armies did. Take Lübeck and Hamburg, glaring at each other across the Elbe in the 1400s. Both thrived on herring. Lübeck's fishermen hauled Baltic catches, while Hamburg's merchants controlled access to the North Sea. When Lübeck's guilds slapped a preservation tax on barrels heading west, Hamburg retaliated by banning Lübeck's ships from its docks entirely. What began as a squabble over fish guts spiraled into a decade-long trade war, with merchants hiring pirates to sink rivals' vessels and bribing dockworkers to lose cargo. These weren't just business disputes, they were economic sieges where starvation came not from blocked grain stores but from empty ledgers. Toll systems weaponized geography with brutal precision. Cologne's archbishops grew rich, forcing Rhine barges to unload goods for inspection and, conveniently, for resale in Cologne's markets, while Deutz, just across the river, withered. A single toll gate on the Danube near Regensburg could triple the price of Hungarian wine by the time it reached Nuremberg, enriching one city while beggaring the next. The cruelty lay in the details. Tolls often targeted specific goods to cripple a rival's specialty. When Bruges taxed English wool at its gates, it wasn't just raising revenue, it was strangling Ypres looms, where weavers depended on those very fleeces. Enter the Hanseatic League, Europe's first attempt at a trade union. In theory, this network of merchant cities should have calmed these feuds. Instead, it often poured fuel on the flames. The League's peace treaties between members like Danzig and Riga frequently masked backroom deals favoring one port's interests over another. Their famous contours, trading posts from London to Novgorod, weren't neutral ground but chess pieces in a larger game. When the Wendish cities Lübeck, Hamburg, Kiel conspired to block Prussian grain from reaching Scandinavia in 1432, it wasn't diplomacy, it was economic warfare by committee. Yet nothing inflamed tensions like mixing money with faith. After the Reformation, a toll collector in Lutheran Bremen might misplace Catholic merchants' cargo, while Calvinist Antwerp's bankers quietly froze accounts tied to Spanish-aligned guilds. The Rhine, once a neutral highway, became a theological border. Catholic Cologne's wine merchants found their barrels mysteriously spoiling when passing through Protestant Dusseldorf. These weren't just squabbles over doctrine, they were excuses to settle old scores. When Augsburg's Lutheran weavers bankrupted their Catholic rivals by hoarding Swabian linen contracts, their sermons rang with triumph. God, it seemed, favored good business as much as good doctrine. The lesson written in these centuries of conflict is stark. twin cities could share a river, a king, even a saint's patronage, but never a balance sheet. Because when the choice came between salvation and silver, history shows which one emptied pews faster. And as Europe's religious wars would soon prove, that reckoning wouldn't stay confined to counting houses for long. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to Wittenberg's church door in 1517, he didn't just challenge the Pope, he shattered the fragile peace between Europe's twin cities. Overnight, rivers became more than trade routes. They turned into theological frontiers. Nuremberg and Bamberg, separated by barely 50 miles of Franconian countryside, found themselves on opposite sides of a chasm. Nuremberg's council declared for Luther, tearing down altars and whitewashing frescoes, while Bamberg's bishop doubled down on Catholic orthodoxy, burning Protestant books in the cathedral square. The main river between them wasn't just water. It was now a border between salvation and heresy, where ferrymen whispered catechisms to passengers before deciding whether to row. Pilgrimage sites, once shared treasures, became ideological trophies. Take Aachen's cathedral, where Charlemagne's bones had drawn faithful from across Christendom. After the Reformation, Protestant princes demanded their subjects stop visiting, calling relics popish superstition. Yet Catholic linen weavers from nearby Monschau kept sneaking across the border, hiding pilgrim badges under their cloaks. The tension erupted in 1581 when Calvinist militia stormed the shrine during Mass, not to pray, but to prove no saint could protect his own tomb. It was a pattern repeated from Trier to Toledo. Sacred spaces weren't just contested, they were weaponized. Yet amid the strife, flickers of pragmatism survived. Medieval Spain's convivencia, the uneasy coexistence of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, had shown it was possible. In Toledo, Mozarabic Christians preserved their ancient liturgy in Arabic script, while Sephardic Jews acted as translators between Berber merchants and Castilian nobles. This fragile balance collapsed under the Inquisition, but its memory lingered in places like Augsburg, where Lutheran goldsmiths still sold chalices to Catholic monasteries. When the Peace of Augsburg decreed cuius regio, ius religio in 1555, letting princes choose their realm's faith, it wasn't tolerance, but a grudging acknowledgement that some divides couldn't be healed by force. The military consequences were inevitable. Strasbourg's Protestant gunsmiths, forbidden from selling to Catholic Freiburg, instead supplied Swedish armies. Cologne's archbishop built a citadel not against Ottoman invaders, but to bombard his own Lutheran subjects across the Rhine. Even saints got drafted into the fight. When Bavarian troops besieged Protestant Regensburg, they hurled relics of Saint Emram into the city with catapults, hoping divine wrath would do what cannon couldn't. But the real tragedy lay in the quiet betrayals. A Catholic wife in Wurzburg lying to priests about her Protestant husband's prayers. A Protestant schoolmaster in Erfurt teaching Catholic children to cross themselves left-handed so their parents wouldn't know. These weren't just doctrinal disputes, they were fractures in the bedrock of community where faith became a currency of suspicion. And as the 30 Years' War would soon prove, when twin cities turned their steeples into watchtowers, the reckoning would drown Europe in blood. The bridges between twin cities weren't just crossings, they were coiled springs waiting to snap. In Vienna and Buda, facing each other across the Danube during the Ottoman Wars, engineers didn't just build fortifications, they designed entire landscapes of paranoia. Vienna's walls didn't just face outward toward the Turks, they bristled with gun ports turned inward toward the river, where a sudden revolt in Buda could spill across the water. The famous Kettenbruck, a chain-reinforced bridge linking the two, wasn't a symbol of unity but a kill zone. At the first whisper of betrayal, Austrian sappers could detonate pre-buried charges, collapsing the span into the river like a drawn blade. Siegecraft became a macabre art in these divided cities. During the 1529 Ottoman assault, Suleiman the Magnificent didn't just surround Buda, he exploited its twin city psychology. Knowing Vienna's defenders would funnel supplies across the river, his spies infiltrated Buda's markets, poisoning grain shipments and bribing ferrymen to report boat schedules. When Vienna's garrison finally starved, it wasn't just Ottoman cannons that broke them. It was the realization their lifeline had become a noose. Innovations bloomed from this mutual distrust. Double-walled defenses like those in Cologne turned city centers into fortresses within fortresses. If Deutz fell, Cologne's inner ramparts, complete with their own wells and granaries, could hold out for months. Nuremberg's engineers took it further, constructing Wasserschutzmauern water walls that could flood the entire Pegnitz River valley, creating a moat wide enough to isolate the city from its twin Fürth. Yet the most fascinating weapons weren't stone or gunpowder. They were the spies who moved like shadows between these mirrored cities. In Strasbourg-Kehl, where French and German territories touched, a single bilingual beggar might gather intelligence from both sides, selling troop movements to the highest bidder. Venetian archives reveal how Hofjuden Jewish court agents played both Christian and Ottoman masters against each other along the Danube, their trade caravans hiding coded messages in Torah scrolls. The ultimate irony, these same bridges built for commerce became espionage highways. A merchant's wagon crossing from Pest to Buda might conceal a Hungarian noble fleeing the Turks, or a Turkish informant wrapped in furs. When the Habsburgs finally retook Buda in 1686, they didn't just find scorched earth, they discovered tunnels under the riverbed, where Ottoman sappers and Hungarian rebels had exchanged messages for decades. In the end, the greatest threat to these cities wasn't the army across the water, but the whispers flowing beneath it, in the dimly lit backrooms of Rialto markets, where Venetian merchants haggled over silks and spices. History's most elaborate spy network was born. The Serenissimo's secret service didn't recruit dagger-wielding assassins, they trained perfumers. A merchant sniffing a barrel of Persian saffron could detect the faint scent of ink beneath the spice, revealing smuggled Ottoman battle plans stuffed in false compartments. These weren't just traders, they were intelligence operatives with cover identities so deep, even their account books lied. Double-entry bookkeeping became triple entry, one column for goods, one for profits, and a cipher for troop movements along the Dalmatian coast. Neutral cities thrived as espionage crossroads. Take 15th century Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, where Catholic and Ottoman agents rubbed shoulders in the Stradon's bustling arcades. A Bosnian carpet seller might slip a coded message into the weave of a prayer rug, knowing the buyer was a Hungarian noble's valet, the real artistry. These markets had unspoken rules. Swiss guards at Lyon's fairs turned blind eyes to whispering diplomats, while Lübeck's harbor masters accepted bribes in Baltic amber, untraceable and far more valuable than coin. Art became the ultimate propaganda weapon. When Titian painted Charles V astride his warhorse at Mühlberg, he didn't just capture an emperor, he airbrushed history. The real Charles had been carried into battle on a litter, crippled by gout, but the portrait showed a unifying monarch straddling an invisible border, his gaze fixed on some distant horizon of imperial unity. Meanwhile, in Antwerp, Protestant woodcuts depicted Catholic bishops as wolves devouring flocks, their printing presses hidden in attics above fish shops. The most brilliant spies weaponized culture itself. A troupe of Italian actors touring the Rhine Valley might perform commedia dell'arte by night, but by dawn their harlequin was sketching fortress layouts in the margins of scripts. Even music carried secrets. The Fugger banking family used lute tablature to encrypt messages, knowing no border guard would suspect a traveling minstrel's sheet music held the debts of kings. Yet for all their cunning, these shadow wars had a fatal flaw. Every doubled agent, every forged letter, every backchannel deal relied on one fragile assumption, that loyalty could be bought, faked, or bent. But when the scales tipped too far, when the whispers grew too loud, the very cities that had bred these games of deception would become their casualties. Because in the end, no cipher could mask the truth written in the faces of those who'd learned too late that every mask, like every border, was just a fiction waiting to be torn away. Stone saints lining Prague's Charles Bridge weren't just religious symbols, they were a Habsburg billboard in sandstone. Each statue, from St. Luitgard to the Crucifixion Group, whispered the same message to crossing merchants. This river, this trade, these people belong to us. Meanwhile, downstream in Dresden, Augustus the Strong commissioned porcelain saints for his own bridges, as if to say Bohemia's stone could be outshone by Saxon china. This was medieval branding at its most brilliant, architecture as a permanent declaration of dominance, where every carved apostle and gilded spire screamed allegiance without uttering a word. Coins turned pockets into propaganda machines. When Vienna minted silver thalers bearing the double-headed eagle, it wasn't just currency. It was a tiny conquest, forcing Hungarian nobles to literally spend the emperor's image in Buda's markets. Rivals retaliated with subtle sabotage. Ghent's minters undercounted the silver in Burgundian coins, knowing each underweight franc would erode trust in the duke's authority. The most brazen power play came from Sigismund of Luxembourg, who stamped his face on both sides of Hungarian denars, a not-so-subtle hint that his rule had no flip side. Heraldry became psychological warfare. Cologne's crest showed 3 golden crowns, mocking Deutz's single-towered emblem. Barcelona's flag flaunted 4 blood-red bars, a direct challenge to rival Valencia's blue and white stripes. Even city mottos weaponized poetry. Nuremberg's quiet and steady taunted restless Bamberg, whose own faith and flame slogan sounded suspiciously like arsonist's pride. These weren't just identifiers, they were battle cries woven into tapestries and carved above doorways, ensuring no citizen forgot who they were supposed to hate. Troubadours turned taverns into theaters of ridicule. A popular drinking song in 14th century, Ghent jeered at Bruges merchants. Your purses are fat, but your wits are lean. You'd trade your own mother for Flemish cheese. Across the Rhine, Mainz's minstrels composed ballads painting Frankfurt's traders as cowards who hid behind their walls like mice in flour sacks. These ditties spread faster than plague, carried by journeymen and pilgrims until every market square echoed with musical mudslinging. The law codified these rivalries into permanence. Augsburg's Stadtrecht forbade wearing rival Ulm's colors within city walls, a dress code for disdain. Venetian courts fined gondoliers if they sang Bergamo's folk songs on the canals. Even saints got drafted into legal battles. When Regensburg claimed exclusive rights to venerate Saint Emmeram, Passau's bishops sued for copyright infringement on relics. Yet beneath this pageantry of spite lay a raw truth. Propaganda worked because it tapped into something deeper than politics. It spoke to identity. A mason carving Prague's bridge saints might grumble about Habsburg taxes, but his chisels still shaped their victory lap. A Nuremberg housewife buying bread with Sigismund's coins might resent the king, but his face still fed her children. This was the genius of medieval soft power. It made dominance feel inevitable, wrapping fists in velvet and selling conquest as culture. And when that failed, well, there were always the catapults. Legal systems in twin cities weren't just different rule books, they were competing visions of order, clashing in the streets where 2 sovereignties met. Take Danzig, where German burghers swore by the Magdeburger Recht, a code so precise it dictated how many nails a barrel maker could use, while Polish nobles outside the walls lived by the Casimir statutes, where justice often flowed from the king's whim. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was chaos with consequences. A baker in the German quarter could be fined for selling bread after noon, while his cousin across the square, under Polish law, kept his ovens blazing until dusk. The real friction came when disputes spilled across jurisdictions. A German merchant's wagon might collide with a Polish noble's carriage at the city gate, but whose court decided the damages. Enter the Bursprechen, hybrid tribunals where judges from both sides haggled over verdicts like marketplace traders. In Torun, these courts operated under a bizarre but effective rule. Verdicts had to rhyme in both languages, forcing compromise through poetry. A famous 1430 case saw a German blacksmith and Polish innkeeper duel over a stolen keg of beer. The judge's solution: the blacksmith forged a new keg, the innkeeper filled it, and both men drank to the rhyming verdict. Schaden getelt, straight begelegt, damages shared, quarrel settled. Yet not all conflicts ended so merrily. When Lübeck's merchants sued Gdansk's dockworkers over spoiled grain in 1512, the case bounced between 4 courts before the grain itself rotted into irrelevance. Trade regulations turned into silent wars. In Bratislava, Hungarian customs officers demanded tolls on every barrel of Slovak wine, unless it was transported by Jewish merchants who paid a separate tolerance tax. Meanwhile, Frankfurt's butchers faced arrest if they sold meat on Catholic fast days, while just across the Main in Offenbach, Lutheran butchers flaunted sausages during Lent. The absurdity peaked in Strasbourg Kale, where French and German bakers used different flour weights, leading to a 3-year bread war where loaves were seized at the bridge like contraband weapons. For ordinary folk, navigating this legal patchwork required cunning. Wives in divided cities like Pressburg became experts in jurisdiction shopping, filing inheritance claims in whichever court favored women. Apprentices carried dual identity papers, swapping guild certificates at the first sign of trouble. Even beggars learned the rules. In Krakow's twin city Kazimierz, alms given under Jewish law couldn't be reclaimed, while Christian charity came with strings attached. The true masters of this system were the Schurfen, lay jurors who memorized both codes and sold their wisdom to the highest bidder. A well-bribed Schurf might misremember whether a theft occurred 2 paces east Polish soil or West German land. Their corruption was so legendary that in Breslau, citizens joked the city's twin towers weren't churches, they were the scales of justice permanently unbalanced. Yet amid the chaos, something remarkable emerged: a grassroots legal Creole. Market squares developed unwritten bridge laws, like letting debtors flee across the river to reset their obligations. Fish sellers adopted hybrid measures, pricing carp by Hungarian weight but herring by Dutch count. This wasn't just survival, it was the birth of a new order where the law bent like a willow between 2 winds. Because when statutes fail, people invent their own justice, and sometimes that justice sticks. Markets in divided cities weren't just places to buy bread, they were theaters of controlled chaos where every transaction came with a side of cultural negotiation. Picture a morning in 15th century Pressburg, where a Hungarian wine seller haggled with a German merchant over a barrel of Tokaj. The bargaining wasn't just about price, it unfolded in a fractured pigeon of Latin, German, and Magyar, with fingers flashing numbers in 3 different counting systems. Nearby, a Bohemian Munachanga's table groaned under the weight of Prague groschen, Venetian ducats, and Ottoman axe, each coin tested for weight by biting, a universal language of distrust. The real power brokers, the Jewish and Armenian traders who moved between all sides, their ledgers scribbled in Hebrew and Armenian script to keep accounts indecipherable to prying customs officers. Romance flourished in these gaps between worlds. In Strasbourg, it wasn't uncommon for a German tanner's daughter to elope with a French mercer's son, their wedding mass performed twice, once in Latin for her family, once in German for his. These unions were more than love stories, they were survival strategies. A marriage certificate from the wrong side of the river could mean trading permits, inheritance rights, even immunity during sieges. But not all cross-border affairs ended happily. When a Burgundian wool merchant married a Ghent weaver's widow in 1482, her guild disowned her until they realized her new husband's connections could bypass Bruges tariffs. Suddenly, the traitor became their most valuable member. Festivals offered brief truces in these simmering rivalries. During Cologne's Kerms fair, Deutz's butchers roasted oxen alongside Cologne's fishmongers, their rivalry forgotten in a haze of ale and carnival puppets. In Nuremberg Fürth, the annual bridge dance saw enemies link arms to perform intricate steps across the Pegnitz, a choreography so precise it mirrored their economic interdependence. Even religion took a holiday. In divided Aachen, Protestants and Catholics shared the Kornelimünster pilgrimage route every 7 years, their competing processions merging into one stream of candlelight. Yet beneath the camaraderie lurked darker currents. That friendly wine cellar in Pressburg, he might be topping his barrels with water for German buyers but filling them properly for Hungarian nobles. The jovial butcher at Cologne's fair, his sausage casings hid contraband spices from rival Lübeck, and those star-crossed lovers, their marriage contract probably included clauses about which side's laws would govern the dowry, a detail that could spark feuds lasting generations. Language turned these tensions into minefields. In Riga, a German burgher's mispronounced Livonian phrase could get his produce accidentally trampled at market. Barcelona's Catalan-speaking porters deliberately mangled Castilian noblemen's orders, delivering cargo to wrong warehouses with feigned ignorance. The most creative sabotage came from Ghent, where Flemish weavers wove hidden insults into tapestries destined for French palaces, a vulgar pun stitched into a saint's robe, a nobleman's face subtly reshaped into a donkey. These weren't just petty grievances, they were the DNA of divided cities, written in the shorthand of everyday life. A loaf of bread could be a peace offering or a provocation, depending on whose weights measured the flour. A love letter might bridge two worlds or get its carrier hanged as a spy, and that festival music drowning out the grumbles of rivals. It was the sound of people pretending, just for a day, that rivers didn't divide them. Until dawn came and the toll gates creaked open once more. Language could be a weapon sharper than any sword in these divided cities. When a Flemish weaver in 14th century Ghent shouted insults at a French-speaking tax collector, he wasn't just venting frustration, he was drawing a line in the cobblestones. The choice between saying "Goeden Dag" or "Bonjour" marked allegiance as clearly as a heraldic banner. In Bruges, where Flemish dialects clashed with the Burgundian court's French, even street names became battlegrounds. Locals stubbornly called the main square De Markt, while officials insisted on La Grande Place, turning every directions into a quiet act of defiance. Translators wielded outsized power in this linguistic minefield. Take the case of Jan van der Kouter, a bilingual notary in 15th century Ypres. By subtly adjusting loan agreements between Flemish merchants and French lenders, shifting interest to gift in Flemish copies, he saved entire guilds from ruin. Other interpreters played riskier games. During the Ghent Revolt of 1539, a translator named Caitlene Swift deliberately mistranslated Emperor Charles V's ultimatum to the city council, softening total surrender into negotiable terms. Her linguistic sleight of hand bought the rebels 3 critical weeks to fortify their walls. Trade hubs bred their own hybrid tongues. In the smoky taverns of medieval Danzig, a pidgin called Hans Slavic emerged, blending German nautical terms with Polish numbers and Kashubian curses. Merchants from Lubeck to Novgorod used it to haggle over amber and grain, creating a language where torgavat, to trade, could mean anything from honest barter to outright fraud depending on the speaker's wink. Similarly, along the Rhine, a patois known as crema latine, merchants' Latin, let Jewish wine traders, Christian boatmen, and Muslim spice dealers strike deals without fully understanding each other's faiths or loyalties. Yet nature had no respect for these man-made divisions. When the St. Marcellus flood of 1362 submerged the Low Countries, rising waters didn't pause at language borders. Dutch-speaking and French-speaking villages drowned alike, their survivors sharing makeshift dikes without asking for translations. Plague, too, was ruthlessly polyglot. The Black Death tore through Latin-chanting monasteries and Yiddish-speaking ghettos with equal ferocity. After the 1456 earthquake leveled much of Naples, Spanish viceroys and Italian locals dug through rubble side by side, communicating in gestures and shared grief. These disasters exposed a bitter truth. While kings and councils drew lines on maps, reality was far messier. A river might divide two legal systems, but it couldn't stop cholera from drifting downstream. A wall could separate French and Flemish quarters, but smoke from a burning plague house would blow wherever the wind dictated. In the end, the only language everyone understood was survival, and that vocabulary had no borders. When the waters rose, the people of Cologne and Deutz forgot they were rivals. The Great Flood of 1342 didn't care which bank was imperial territory or which owed fealty to the archbishop. It swallowed both. For weeks, burghers from Cologne's patrician families worked shoulder to shoulder with Deutz's ferrymen, piling sandbags and reinforcing the shared levees that kept the Rhine at bay. Even the bitterest foes became allies when the river turned against them all. Yet once the waters receded, so did the unity. Cologne's council sent Deutz a bill for flood defense maintenance, sparking a legal battle that lasted longer than the flood itself. Plague exposed even uglier truths. As the Black Death crept along trade routes in 1348, Nuremberg's magistrates sealed the city gates, posting crossbowmen to shoot anyone approaching from plague-stricken Fürth. Across the Alps, Milan's rulers took a darker approach. They walled entire infected neighborhoods inside their own homes, brick by brick, leaving the healthy and sick to perish together. Meanwhile, in Venice, officials pioneered something radical, a 40-day quarantine on distant islands, giving birth to the word quarantina. The results spoke for themselves. Nuremberg's death toll soared while Venice's slowed, but the cost was a legacy of fear that turned neighbors into potential carriers, their coughs met with suspicion for generations. Famine played no favorites either. When crop failures struck the Danube basin in 1316, Bratislava's Hungarian nobles hoarded grain behind guarded storehouses, while Pressburg's German merchants sold theirs at ruinous prices. The desperate poor didn't riot, they voted with their feet. Entire families crossed the river at night, abandoning one city's starvation for the other's uncertain mercy. Some found work digging mass graves, others were turned back at spear point. Yet amid the suffering, glimmers of humanity endured. During the 1527 typhus outbreak, Strasbourg's printers, who normally competed fiercely with Kehl's workshops, shared medicinal recipes in hastily published broadsheets. In Ghent, the same guilds that had revolted against Burgundian taxes now pooled resources to feed orphans from both Flemish and French-speaking quarters. Even animals got drawn into the crisis. Rats fleeing Cologne's flooded cellars swam to Deutz, bringing plague fleas that made the river's currents irrelevant. These disasters laid bare a brutal calculus. Survival often demanded cooperation, but memory bred resentment. The shared dikes built during floods became bargaining chips in later trade wars. Quarantine islands that saved lives also birthed new words for exclusion: lazaretto, cordon sanitaire, that would echo through centuries of future panics. And when the starving survivors of Pressburg finally revolted in 1319, they didn't storm the nobles' granaries first. They burned the tax records that had demanded grain as tribute even as children wasted away. Because the greatest disaster wasn't flood or famine, it was the realization that some fractures ran too deep for even catastrophe to mend. When the peasants of northern France rose in revolt during the summer of 1358, they didn't just burn castles, they weaponized geography itself. The Jacquerie Rebellion, named after the derisive nickname Jacques Bonhomme, given to peasants by nobles, saw villages on both banks of the Oise River unite against their feudal overlords. What made this uprising extraordinary wasn't just its violence, but its strategy. Rebels from Beauvais and Compiègne, towns normally divided by trade rivalries and petty borders, coordinated attacks using river barges as mobile command centers. Their leader, Guillaume Cal, wasn't some unwashed rabble-rouser but a former soldier who understood the weaknesses of divided loyalties. He recruited disillusioned garrison troops from twin cities like Senlis and Creil, men who knew both the nobles' tactics and the terrain's hidden paths. The Maillotins of Paris took rebellion to darker extremes. In 1382, when Charles VI's regents raised taxes to fund yet another pointless war, the city's merchants didn't just protest, they armed themselves with lead mallets, maillets looted from construction sites. But here's where it gets fascinating. They didn't act alone. The suburbs of Saint Denis and Saint Martin, normally at odds with Paris proper, joined the uprising, turning the Seine's bridges into barricades. For 3 terrifying months, the rebels controlled both sides of the river, cutting off royal forces from reinforcement routes. Their temporary Republic of the Maillotins even issued its own coinage stamped not with the king's face, but with a clenched fist holding a mallet. Reprisals reshaped the landscape literally. After crushing the Jacquerie, nobles didn't just hang rebels. They demolished entire riverside villages to prevent future alliances. The once thriving market town of Mello vanished from maps, its stones repurposed to build a fortress watching over the Oise crossings. In Paris, the monarchy tore down the Grand Châtelet prison's outer walls, not for defense, but to deny future rebels a ready-made stronghold. Most chillingly, they instituted the droit de suite, allowing lords to pursue fugitives across city boundaries, a legal dagger aimed at the heart of urban sanctuary traditions. External empires smelled blood in these fractures. During the Flanders revolts of the 1380s, English agents slipped into Ghent and Bruges, whispering promises of wool trade concessions if the cities switched allegiance. The rebels' fatal mistake, believing outsiders would honor their autonomy. When English troops arrived, they didn't bring trade deals, they brought garrisons, turning Flemish weavers into subjects of a foreign crown. Similarly, the Holy Roman Empire exploited divisions during the Swabian city wars, playing Ulm against Augsburg until both were too weakened to resist imperial mediation, annexation. Yet amid the ashes, some rebels became legends. Pieter de Koninck, the weaver poet who led the Bruges Matins uprising, didn't just kill French occupiers in 1302. He composed ballads about it, turning his deeds into folk anthems that outlasted dynasties. In Mainz, the fiery preacher Johann Jus wove theology into rebellion, arguing that Christ himself had been a divine Mailletin overthrowing spiritual tyrants. Their true power lay not in weapons, but in symbols, proof that when cities united across borders, they could rewrite the rules, if only briefly, because the cruelest lesson of these revolts wasn't their failure, but their near successes. Time and again, twin cities came within a hair's breadth of victory until some betrayal, some tactical misstep, let the old order slither back. and waiting in the shadows always were the empires ready to turn rebellions into annexations. The greatest threat to twin cities often didn't come from within. It arrived with the smiling diplomats and velvet-gloved envoys of distant empires. Take the Teutonic Knights, those white-cloaked warlords of the Baltic, who didn't just conquer Prussian towns but turned them against each other with chilling precision. When Danzig and Elbing clashed over grain tariffs in the 1340s, the knights didn't mediate, they fueled the fire. To Danzig's merchants, they whispered promises of exclusive amber trading rights. To Elbing's shipbuilders, they offered protection from Danzig's greed. The result, two thriving ports bled each other dry while the knights' coffers swelled with the profits of their manufactured feud. Even the papacy played this game with celestial audacity. During the Great Schism, when two rival popes claimed St. Peter's throne, they didn't just excommunicate each other, they weaponized twin cities. Avignon's Clement VII granted indulgences to Nuremberg's patricians if they rejected Rome's Urban VI, while Urban retaliated by blessing the craftsmen of neighboring Fürth. Suddenly, a theological dispute became a hometown brawl, with saints' relics paraded like militia banners and cathedral pulpits transformed into recruitment centers. No one mastered divide and rule quite like the Ottomans. As Suleiman's armies advanced up the Danube, they didn't besiege Buda and Pest simultaneously, they played them like a chessboard. To Buda's Hungarian nobles, they offered autonomy and tax breaks. To Pest's German burghers, they hinted at restored trade routes to the Black Sea. By the time both cities realized they'd been maneuvered into isolation, the Sultan's janissaries were already raising crescent flags over their shared bridges. Yet occasionally, the meddlers overplayed their hand. In 1411, when the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund tried to pit Cologne against Deutz by granting one city a monopoly on Rhine tolls, the response was extraordinary. Both cities temporarily lowered their drawbridges and let each other's merchants pass toll-free. It wasn't brotherly love but cold calculus. Better to lose some silver to a rival than all of it to an outsider. Similarly, when Venice schemed to turn Zadar against Split along the Dalmatian coast, the two cities did the unthinkable. They forged a secret pact, using Venetian coins to bribe the same corrupt officials who were supposed to keep them divided. These flashes of unity terrified empires more than any rebellion, because they revealed the truth. Twin cities might bicker like siblings, but when outsiders reached too greedily into their cradle, even bitter rivals could remember whose blood they shared. And that realization, fleeting as it was, could shake thrones. Pirates didn't discriminate when their longships sliced through Baltic fog. They raided German Lübeck as eagerly as Danish Helsingborg, torching warehouses and dragging merchants into slavery regardless of whose crown they owed fealty to. That's what made the Victual Brothers the most feared pirate brotherhood of the 1400s, such unlikely peacemakers. When their raids crippled trade from Riga to Rostock, bitter rival cities did the unthinkable. They formed the Seabund, a naval alliance that ignored decades of tariff wars and dynastic squabbles. For a few brief years, Lübeck's warships escorted Polish Gdansk's grain fleets, while Stralsund's fishermen shared intelligence with sworn enemies in Copenhagen. Even the Teutonic Knights, usually masters of divide and rule, grudgingly lent their ports to the effort. The solidarity was awe-inspiring and utterly fragile. Because once the last pirate gallows creaked on the strand, old habits returned with a vengeance. Lübeck's merchants immediately slapped new tariffs on Swedish iron shipments, while Danzig's council accused Elbing of hoarding amber revenues. The Seabund's grand harbor feasts gave way to whispered accusations of who'd skimmed the alliance's silver. This pattern repeated across Europe. In the Adriatic, Venice and Ragusa cooperated brilliantly to smash Narentine pirates until the day their shared enemy sank, and Venetian galleys blockaded Ragusan traders as smugglers. Along the Rhine, cities that had united against river outlaws like the Rhenish Bund dissolved into squabbles over whose bridges got maintenance funds. The answer to why these alliances crumbled lies in a brutal truth. Fear binds tighter than friendship. A pirate fleet on the horizon forced cities to see their interdependence, but once the threat faded, so did the urgency. Rulers who'd praised cooperation during crises now saw it as a threat. Why let subjects grow accustomed to self-organization when dependence on royal protection kept them obedient? And merchants who'd shared ships during wartime now jealously guarded their trade ledgers. The greatest casualty wasn't the alliances themselves, but the proof they offered. That cross-border collaboration wasn't just possible, but wildly effective. Decline crept in like a thief. As the 1600s dawned, Europe's patchwork of twin-city kingdoms began unraveling under centralized states. Sweden's Vasa kings absorbed once autonomous Baltic ports into a monolithic crown. The Habsburgs stamped Vienna and Prague's unique privileges into uniform provincial codes. Even mighty Bruges, whose canals had whispered Flemish and French in equal measure, found itself strangled by silting rivers and Spanish decrees. The final insult came with cartography itself. New maps erased the old dotted lines of shared sovereignty, drawing borders as if cities were chess pieces to be claimed, not living entities with their own rhythms. Yet something lingered in the cobblestones. In Danzig, brewers still used hybrid German-Polish mash recipes long after Prussia annexed the city. Strasbourg's bakers secretly kept dual-sized loaves, one for French inspectors, one for German nostalgists. These weren't just traditions, they were quiet acts of defiance, proof that even as kingdoms fell, the memory of interdependence refused to die. Because rivers might divide cities, but they also connect them, carrying not just goods and gunboats, but the stubborn idea that no border is ever truly absolute. The golden age of twin cities didn't end with a bang, but with a slow, suffocating shift like a river changing course grain by grain. When Portuguese caravels rounded Africa's Cape of Good Hope in 1488, they didn't just discover new trade routes, they rendered centuries of riverine commerce obsolete. Overnight, the Rhine and Danube became backwaters, their bustling ports left staring at empty docks. Antwerp's merchants, who'd grown fat on English wool and Flemish cloth, watched helplessly as spices from the Indies began flowing through Lisbon instead. Even mighty Lübeck, queen of the Hanseatic League, saw her Baltic herring trade dwindle as Dutch fleets bypassed her entirely, sailing straight to Scandinavian fishing grounds. The cruel twist, many twin cities had financed the very voyages that doomed them. Bruges bankers bankrolled early explorers, never imagining their gold would dig their own graves. Centralized kingdoms delivered the final blow. France's Louis XI didn't conquer Burgundy's twin cities. He starved them into submission. By stripping Ghent and Bruges of their treasured tax exemptions, he forced their merchants to kneel before royal parliaments in Paris. Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella went further, replacing Barcelona's centuries-old Consolat de Mar maritime courts with crown-appointed judges who answered to Madrid. These weren't just bureaucratic changes, they were cultural assassinations. When Augsburg's Fugger bankers tried to protest Habsburg tax demands in 1523, Emperor Charles V simply revoked their city charter, proving even the wealthiest burghers were no match for gunpowder and absolutism. Then came the Frost, the Little Ice Age. That grim climatic curtain descending around 1550 turned Europe's breadbaskets into wastelands. The Oder River froze solid for months, strangling trade between Frankfurt and Slubach. Alpine passes buried under perpetual snow severed Geneva from its Savoyard twin, Chambéry. Starving peasants from the flooded Po Valley swarmed into Milan and Pavia, only to find their granaries empty too. Cities that had weathered wars and plagues found themselves helpless against something far simpler: bad harvests year after year. The Danube, once a liquid highway of grain and wine, became a frozen scar dividing hungry territories. Yet from this wreckage rose unexpected survivors. Hamburg, shrewdly betting on Atlantic trade, eclipsed her Hanseatic sisters by welcoming Dutch refugees and their shipbuilding skills. Nuremberg's craftsmen pivoted from luxury goods to precision instruments, supplying the very armies that crushed their neighbors. And in a twist of irony, some of the most resilient cities were those that had always been poorest, like Pressburg and Bratislava, whose lack of wealth spared them the attention of greedy monarchs. The true legacy of these fallen twins lies not in their ruins, but in the lessons they carved into history's stone. They proved that rivers could unite as easily as divide, that loyalty was negotiable until the taxes came due, and that no wall, however thick, could withstand the tides of time. Most of all, they remind us that cities aren't just bricks and laws, they're living things, breathing through their markets, singing in their dialects, and dying when the world forgets their song. And if you listen closely to the wind between ancient towers, you can still hear the echoes of their last, unheeded warning. Prosperity built on geography is fleeting, but adaptability is eternal. The echoes of medieval twin cities still whisper through modern maps, if you know where to listen. Take Alsace-Lorraine, that rolling stretch of land between France and Germany where Strasbourg's cathedral spire has watched borders shift for centuries. The region's identity crisis didn't start with Napoleon or Bismarck. It traces back to the 1500s, when Strasbourg's Protestant printers and Catholic Metz's clergy turned the Rhine into a theological fault line. Today, that legacy lives in quirks like bilingual street signs and the way Alsatian vineyards still label Riesling bottles with Gothic script, a nod to German heritage even as they toast French holidays. The EU's Strasbourg-Brussels power split isn't just bureaucracy, it's a deliberate echo of medieval dual capitals like Buda and Pest, balancing rival influences through architecture and protocol. Cross into the Basque country, and the past pulses even louder. Bilbao and San Sebastián may share Euskara as their mother tongue, but their medieval charters pit them against each other for fishing rights and trade privileges. That ancient competition simmers beneath modern debates over Basque autonomy, where Bilbao's industrial past clashes with San Sebastián's tourist-fueled prosperity. The Guggenheim Museum's titanium curves, they're just the latest chapter in a centuries-old game of one-upmanship, where cultural landmarks replace castle walls in asserting dominance. Even EU subsidy policies can't escape these old ghosts. When Brussels allocates funds to border regions, the formulas often mirror medieval trade pacts, favoring riverine hubs like Maastricht while leaving upland towns like Aachen scrambling. It's no coincidence that the fiercest battles over EU fishing quotas erupt between ports like Gdansk and Kaliningrad, whose 14th century herring wars never truly ended. Walk through Gdansk's reconstructed artist court, where frescoes of maritime battles adorn the walls, and you'll realize modern trade disputes are just old rivalries in tailored suits. Some cities wear their divided history like armor. In Frankfurt and Offenbach, separated by a mere bend in the main river, you can still trace the invisible line where Lutheran Frankfurt's blue and white banners once faced Offenbach's Calvinist red. Their modern rivalry plays out in soccer stadiums and jazz festivals rather than crossbow duels, but the undercurrent remains. Similarly, Budapest's chain bridge isn't just a tourist attraction, it's a carefully reconstructed peace treaty in iron and stone, linking two cities that spent 500 years under separate crowns. The true marvels are the accidental time capsules. In Basel's Mittelrer Brook, builders left a gap in the railing where medieval toll collectors once stood, their hands outstretched for coins. Toledo's labyrinthine Juderia still follows the escape routes Jews used during 14th century pogroms, now repurposed as romantic alleyways. These aren't just relics, they're living lessons in how borders shape memory. When you sip Rudesheimer coffee in a Cologne tavern or hear Slovenian folk songs drifting over Italy's Gorizia border, you're tasting and hearing the stubborn afterlife of twin cities that refuse to fully merge or fully part. Perhaps the most telling comparison lies in today's sister city programs, when Minneapolis and St. Paul host joint cultural festivals, or when Seoul and Pyongyang briefly illuminated synchronized peace projections along the DMZ. They're replaying medieval strategies using pageantry to paper over fault lines. The difference: modern twins choose their partnerships, while their medieval ancestors had alliances thrust upon them by marriage treaties and mercenary armies. Yet the goal remains eerily similar: to pretend, if only for a season, that rivers and borders are connectors rather than dividers, until the next crisis, the next tariff war, the next identity debate, proving some rhythms of history are harder to break than any wall. Berlin's scarred landscape tells a story medieval merchants would recognize instantly: how a city cleaved in two can become a battlefield of competing loyalties. When the wall rose in 1961, it didn't just slice through streets, it resurrected an ancient playbook of division. West Berlin's neon-lit Kurfürstendamm and East Berlin's drab Alexanderplatz became modern versions of rival riverbanks, each flaunting their ideology like heraldic banners. The parallels are uncanny. Just as 14th century Ghent and Bruges weaponized trade, Cold War Berlin turned milk deliveries and subway lines into political chess moves. Western chocolate bars smuggled to the east became the new contraband wool, while the Stasi's informants mirrored the spies who once lurked between Cologne and Deutz. Yet the grim irony: while medieval cities fractured under crowns and tariffs, Berlin's rupture came from abstractions: Marxism versus capitalism, broadcast through loudspeakers instead of town criers. Cross to Cyprus and the divides grow even starker. Nicosia's Green Line, part demilitarized zone, part open wound, echoes the no-man's lands between medieval twin cities, where farmers once tilled fields under competing flags. The Venetian walls, built to repel Ottomans, now partition Greek and Turkish Cypriots, their cannons frozen in time like relics of a 30-year siege. Here, the old playbook of economic sabotage persists. Turkish lira circulates north of the line, euros to the south, with merchants swapping currencies as deftly as Danzig's traders once juggled groschen and ducats. But unlike medieval conflicts, these divisions aren't fueled by dynastic marriages. They're frozen by unrecognized passports and UN buffer zones, where peacekeepers play the role of exasperated serf and jurors. The Koreas offer the most haunting reflection of all. Seoul and Pyongyang aren't just ideological opposites, they're a looking-glass war of competing legacies. Kim Il-sung's Juche towers loom like modern cathedrals, while Seoul's neon-lit Gangnam district thrives as a capitalist marketplace. The DMZ's razor wire could be a dead ringer for the chain barriers medieval cities lowered to block rivals, except here, the merchants are propaganda balloons drifting across the 38th parallel. Yet even in this standoff, glimmers of medieval pragmatism surface. The Keesong Industrial Complex, where Southern capital met Northern labor before its closure, briefly channeled the spirit of Strasbourg and Kehl's cross-border workshops. Its failure wasn't due to geography, but to the same fatal flaw that doomed Burgundy. When trust evaporates, so does shared prosperity. What can diplomats learn from these echoes? First, that division always follows predictable paths: rivers, roads, and wallets. The EU's success in softening borders didn't come from erasing differences, but from mimicking medieval trade pacts on a continental scale. Second, that identity outlasts ideology. Just as Flemish weavers clung to their dialect under French rule, modern Donetsk rebels wave Russian flags while speaking Ukrainian at home. Most crucially, these modern divides remind us that walls are temporary. It's the people who endure. The Berlin Wall fell, but its shadow lingers in rent-controlled apartments and generational resentment. Nicosia's barricades may someday crumble like the bastions of old Pressburg, but the scars and the stories will remain. So here's a question to ponder. If you could whisper advice to the rulers of these divided cities, medieval or modern, what would it be? Would you urge them to build more bridges or to guard their gates? To share their bread or hoard their silver? The answers aren't in history books, they're in the choices we make today, every time we draw a line or extend a hand. Because whether it's mortar or ideology that divides us, the river keeps flowing, and one day the currents always shift. What if history had taken just one different turn? Picture Duke Charles the Bold of Burgundy surviving that icy Swiss battlefield in 1477, his ambitions unbroken. Instead of his fractured lands being carved up by France and the Habsburgs, imagine a united Burgundian kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Alps, a superpower of silk and steel, where Flemish weavers and Burgundian vintners built an economic juggernaut. Would Antwerp's docks have rivaled Venice? Could Ghent's cloth halls have set global fashion trends for centuries? This wasn't just a pipe dream. Burgundy's dukes came agonizingly close, their marriage alliances and military campaigns weaving a tapestry that nearly held. But when Charles fell, the threads unraveled, leaving us to wonder, was this Europe's most avoidable collapse? Now shift the lens eastward. The Kalmar Union, that fragile knot tying Scandinavia together, crumbled under Danish heavy-handedness. But what if Sweden's nobles hadn't rebelled in 1520? Picture a Baltic empire where Stockholm's iron and Copenhagen's herring fed a unified naval force, locking the Hanseatic League out of northern trade. Would Lübeck's merchants have become mere middlemen? Might Viking longships have evolved into a Scandinavian armada dominating the Atlantic? The Kalmar kings had the blueprint: shared languages, intertwined royal bloodlines, and a common enemy in German traders. Their fatal flaw: treating Sweden as a tax farm rather than a partner. One Gustav Vasa with a grievance, and the whole edifice splintered. Or consider the grandest what if of all, a Holy Roman Empire that actually worked. Not the fractured mess of squabbling princes we know, but a realm where Frankfurt's bankers and Nuremberg's craftsmen answered to a strong central crown. Imagine imperial reforms succeeding, with Rhine tolls funding a standing army instead of lining local dukes' pockets. Could this alternate empire have halted Ottoman advance at Vienna? Might it have colonized the Americas under a single banner, leaving Spain and England scrambling? The pieces were there: imperial diets, shared legal codes, even a common enemy in France. Yet every time unity seemed possible, some petty elector or rebellious city council pulled the thread. Here's where you come in. Scroll down and weigh in. Which kingdom's collapse stings the most? Was it Burgundy's near miss at greatness, the Kalmar Union's wasted potential, or the Holy Roman Empire's slow motion unraveling? Debate which ruler's arrogance or which city's rebellion sealed their fate. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about the roads not taken, the alliances not forged, the grudges that cost empires. And as we'll see in our final chapter, those lessons aren't buried in the past. They're etched into every border dispute and trade war today, whispering a warning we do well to hear. The medieval rulers who thrived understood a paradox that still baffles modern leaders. Power grows when shared wisely. Take the Hohenstaufen emperors who let Italian city-states like Genoa and Pisa keep their maritime laws while still swearing fealty to the crown. These emperors didn't just tolerate local autonomy, they weaponized it by allowing Genoa's merchants to govern their own trade disputes and Pisa's admirals to patrol their own waters. They turned rival cities into a decentralized navy that outmaneuvered Venice. The lesson: control less to gain more. Fast forward to today, and Singapore's playbook reads like a medieval manual updated for skyscrapers. Just as 14th century Bruges balanced Flemish and French quarters with separate market regulations, Singapore's hawker centers blend Malay, Chinese, and Indian cuisines under one roof, each stall operating by its community's traditions while adhering to shared hygiene standards. The secret isn't forced assimilation, but what urbanist Jane Jacobs called organized complexity. Medieval Lübeck did this by letting the Danish quarter keep its Norse customs while following Hanseatic trade rules. Modern Singapore replicates it with bilingual education and multi-ethnic housing quotas. Yet history screams warnings about heavy-handedness. When Spain's Philip II tried to impose Castilian laws on Barcelona's centuries-old usages customs in the 1580s, he didn't just face protests, he sparked the Reaper's War. Similarly, Microsoft's early missteps with Nokia's acquisition reveal how modern giants repeat medieval blunders, imposing top-down cultures on proud local ecosystems. Contrast this with the Habsburgs' approach to Prague's Jewish quarter, granting self-governance through the Judenschulord Nung statutes, which kept the ghetto loyal even during Ottoman invasions. The sweet spot lies in what political scientists now call subsidiarity, solving problems at the lowest effective level. Medieval Hungary's comitatus system let border regions like Transylvania raise militias tailored to Ottoman raids, while modern Germany's Länder governments customize education policies to regional industries. Both prove that unity isn't about uniformity, it's about alignment. Like a skilled conductor, the best leaders don't force every instrument to play the same note. They harmonize distinct voices into something greater. So here's the challenge for today's decision makers. Will you be a Burgundian duke bleeding cities dry with centralized taxes, or a Holy Roman Emperor weaving diversity into strength? The answer could determine whether your kingdom thrives, or becomes another cautionary tale etched in history's ledger. Because whether you're ruling walled cities or global corporations, the ancient truth remains: people will fight for autonomy, but they'll die for belonging. History never truly repeats, it echoes. The rise and fall of cross-border kingdoms wasn't just a cycle of treaties and betrayals. It was a chorus of human voices straining to be heard over the din of ambition. Think of the Flemish weaver's calloused hands, weaving tapestries for Burgundian dukes while his children whispered rebellion in the alleyways. Picture the Jewish moneylender in Prague, balancing ledgers in Hebrew and German, always one pogrom away from ruin. These weren't footnotes to history, they were the heartbeat of realms built on fractured loyalties. For every golden age of trade and tolerance, there came the inevitable reckoning: taxes too heavy, borders too rigid, promises too hollow. And when the cracks widened, it was never the crowned heads who paid the steepest price, but the merchant whose stall burned in the riot, the farmer whose fields fed rival armies, the child who learned to pray in a language her grandparents wouldn't recognize. A 14th century chronicler from Ghent captured this fragility in words that still sting. A kingdom divided is like a bridge with two builders, each convinced their design will hold until the river swells and sweeps them both away. That river still flows today, not just through the cobblestone ghosts of Bruges or Buda, but in every place where identity and allegiance collide. the next time you cross a bridge between neighborhoods, counties, or even voting districts, listen closely. The murmurs of medieval guilds and garrison towns might surprise you. Your own streets likely hide these echoes. Maybe it's the bilingual bakery sign hinting at old borders, or the park bench carved with the names of long-dead rivals. History isn't confined to textbooks. It's etched in the angles of rooftops, the cadence of local jokes, even the grudging respect between rival sports teams. So go exploring, trace the fault lines in your landscape, and you'll find the same dramas playing out with different costumes. If these tales of tangled loyalties and shattered crowns resonated with you, consider subscribing. We're just getting started unearthing history's buried blueprints. And who knows, the next deep dive might reveal secrets hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the dots between then and now. After all, the past never really fades. It just waits for the right moment to whisper its warnings again. Bratislava and Pozsony, two names for the same city, split not by geography but by memory. On the Danube's left bank, Slovak Bratislava flaunts its hilltop castle and UFO-themed bridge, while Hungarian Pozsony lingers in faded cafe signs and the whispers of elderly patrons ordering Krame's pastry in Magyar. This isn't just a language quirk, it's a centuries-old identity tug-of-war. When Habsburg Empress Maria Theresa held court here in the 1700s, the city's German-speaking elite called it Pressburg, its Slavic traders called it Prishporok, and its Jewish merchants scribbled Personium in Hebrew deeds. The real rivalry, beer. Bratislava's flagship brewery, Stein, once competed with Pozsony's forgotten Kobaniai, a feud settled not with swords, but with competing beer halls where patrons pledged allegiance by clinking steins under rival coats of arms. Then there's Novgorod and Pskov, Russia's medieval odd couple. Novgorod's onion domes and birch bark letters scream mercantile swagger. It was the Hanseatic League's easternmost outpost, where German traders haggled over Arctic fox pelts under the watchful eyes of Orthodox saints. Pskov, just a day's ride west, played the grim little brother. Its Kremlin walls, thick enough to deflect cannonballs, bore scars from Livonian knights' attacks. Their shared saint, Prince Dovmont, epitomizes their dynamic. Novgorod painted him as a pious scholar. Pskov depicted him sword in hand, mid-battle cry. Even their bells told stories. Novgorod's carillon rang with intricate fugues, while Pskov's single gargantuan blagovist could be heard for miles, a sonic battering ram. For truly quirky twins, meet Torun and Bydgoszcz, Poland's gingerbread and waterway duo. Torun's medieval bakers, bound by a 500-year-old guild charter, still shape Pierniki cookies using carved molds depicting Teutonic knights. Meanwhile, Bydgoszcz's entire economy floated on rafts. Its Bydgoszcz Folla festival reenacts the log drives that sent Baltic timber cascading down the Biardie River. Their rivalry peaked in the 1500s when Torun accused Bydgoszcz of stealing its gingerbread recipes, a crime punishable by excommunication. Today, visitors can taste test the evidence at competing bakeries, then walk it off along Bydgoszcz's Venice-like canals, where houseboats bob where grain barges once docked. Want to walk these hidden divides? Start in Komárno and Komárom, a single town split by the Danube when Czechoslovakia was carved from Hungary in 1920. The bridge between them now links Slovak pubs serving Kafola soda to Hungarian seasada taverns stewing goulash, or seek out Vyborg and Lapinranta, one a Russian fortress town with crumbling Art Nouveau, the other a Finnish lakeside retreat where saunas outnumber stoplights. Their Cold War chill has thawed into boutique tourism with joint ferry tickets and bilingual museum plaques. So pack a notebook and an appetite. These forgotten twins don't just live in history books, They thrive in steins of unfiltered lager, in the crunch of centuries-old gingerbread, in the way a border crossing can feel like stepping through a looking glass. And who knows, you might just find yourself scribbling postcards from both sides of the river, torn between which version of the story to tell. If you're hungry to dive deeper into the world of medieval twin cities, let me point you toward some brilliant minds who helped shape this story. Chris Wickham's The Inheritance of Rome is a masterclass in understanding how fragmented post-Roman Europe laid the groundwork for these divided loyalties. His chapter on the Rhineland trade networks is especially eye-opening. For a boots-on-the-cobblestones perspective, Barbara Hannewald's The Ties That Bound reveals how ordinary folks navigated these fractured sovereignties through marriage contracts and guild ledgers. And if you crave voices straight from the source, crack open the Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's Great Survey, where entries for border towns like Chester and Shrewsbury read like cryptic battle reports, tallying not just pigs and plows, but which families owed fealty to which rival lords. Primary sources from these eras are treasure chests of unintended drama. The Ghent municipal accounts from 1345 don't just list tax revenues, they record payments to spies watching Bruges grain shipments. The Chronicle of Novgorod casually mentions how the city's bridge-keepers took bribes to let Pskov's merchants bypass tariffs. Even saints' lives get juicy. The Vita of Saint Godric describes how this smuggler-turned monk exploited the legal grey zone between Durham and Lindisfarne's competing bishoprics. Now a confession: history is a living thing, and new discoveries reshape our understanding daily. If you spot an overlooked treaty or a fascinating local chronicle from your own region's divided past, shout it out in the comments. This is a conversation, not a lecture. And for those who love this deep dive into border politics, buckle up. Our next episode ventures into the even messier world of medieval succession crises, where thrones didn't pass smoothly from parent to child, but were snatched by uncles, cousins, and the occasional ambitious pastry chef. Trust me, the Wars of the Roses will look like a polite squabble once you see what happened when three kings claimed Hungary's crown simultaneously.